I ordered my Alexa history, and I was listening to the period of time since the FBI had come to our house because I was very nervous what I'd said around it. And I hear my little girl's voice say, "Alexa, why is mommy crying?" Just like broke my heart because it immediately changed our family. I went from being in a completely engaged, involved mom to just I was destroyed at first because I was so afraid. Like when that kind of power comes for you, people always say, "Oh, the truth always wins." The truth does not always win. That's the hard reality. And but I will say, like at that moment when I heard my daughter saying that, it was at that moment where I said, I have to do every single thing so that no matter how this turns out, she knows we tried. And that was, my
Yes.
inspiration for standing up.
So how many of you have seen American Nightmare? It's this Netflix documentary. It's been trending, been #1 most times when I check. I just finished watching it the other night, and I don't want to spoil it. You should just go ahead and watch it on your own. But what gives me hope about this documentary, and if you haven't seen it, Taking Care of Maya, is that while popular, it will also serve to wake up what I call the normies, that there are federal agencies that are absolutely corrupt, that have to validate their existence. Law enforcement is not always on your side, and the media machine is no longer an advocate for the public, but propaganda PR for the powerful. The story we're sharing today, one of corporate collusion with the government, is so heartbreaking and shocking. It would be unbelievable if it weren't for the courage of the woman who had to endure it with her family. I'm Kristi Leigh, and this is a special edition of The Counter Narrative.
Side.
We're going to get to that major story in just a moment, but I figured we'd start today with an update from Communist Canada. From the Daily Skeptic, Trudeau government faked intelligence to frame Freedom Convoy truckers as violent extremists, investigation finds. Now, this was from a months-long public investigation revealing that Canadian government used disinformation. They're the ones that were using disinformation to crack down on the Freedom Convoy protest led by truckers demanding an end to COVID-19 vaccine mandates in February of 2022. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Canada's national police force, then promoted this false information to other nations. The discovery is significant because it contributes to a pattern of intelligence agencies from the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all collaborating on surveillance since World War II, being caught abusing their powers to investigate and persecute the political enemies of elected officials. And this comes on the heels of a federal court determining Trudeau's use of Emergencies Act unconstitutional. Didn't think I would get to see the day where he would be held accountable, but thankfully that has been said. They used this Emergencies Act to rationalize seizing bank accounts and preventing donations to the trucker convoy, standing up for their most basic freedoms, for our most basic freedoms. And here they were in the cold, and some taking multiple weeks of time off work, trying to stand in the gap for us, and they couldn't even have access to their money at this time. Thankfully, there's going to be some accountability there. Well, we've already seen examples, of course, of money seizure happening here before anyone has even been charged with a crime. We're going to be talking about that in just a moment as well. But first, we can celebrate the reckoning that mass media is experiencing right now. Washington Post's Taylor Lorenz was whining about mass layoffs and the growing irrelevancy of mainstream media just the other day. Many were sharing that on Twitter. And now we have this from Western Journal. CNN gets annihilated by obscure Western network, History Channel, and primetime ratings. There are those ratings. Now Jim and Tammy Faye's Western Channel is ranking higher viewership than CNN. It turns out that many would rather watch Bonanza than the talking heads lying to them. But instead instead of our society recognizing the crumbling ideals of true journalism, a border crisis, or the threat to our freedoms, it's Stanley Cups that are most important right now. So important that 7 Target employees were terminated over purchasing special edition Stanley Cups, according to Brightgram. One employee, Catherine Carter, was terminated after purchasing a pink stainless steel insulated cup, which she bought because her mother had passed away from breast cancer, and she was fired. Her and others say they weren't aware of this policy about purchasing high demand items. Some even offered to give the cups back, but they remained terminated. So this is where we're at. Obsession with overpriced cups, with everything else going on. And while we're at it, why don't we just brazenly celebrate Satan? BPR says Amazon will debut a show celebrating Satan, demons, porn, where angels are the enemy. And this is after its success on YouTube. It's called Has Been Hell, and it's a children's show apparently depicting Satan as misunderstood and God as the enemy. Well, I imagine our guest today isn't surprised that Amazon would embrace hell after putting her through hell. Her name is Amy Nelson. She's a mom of 4, like myself, entrepreneur and an attorney. And here is one of her tweets. She says, I think it's just hitting me that my family survived a 4-year, $100 million campaign by Ajaxi and Amazon to imprison and bankrupt my husband. Civil forfeiture, FBI raids, federal racketeering lawsuit. My husband, our parents, our girls, me, we are tough as hell. And I would certainly agree with that. So please welcome Amy to the Counter Narrative. Thank you, Amy, for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me, Kristi.
And we needed you for the whole show because your story is so wild, takes so many twists and turns. But first of all, Amy, you're just an inspiration on your ability to keep going and going strong in the face of so much adversity. You're facing so many different elements. You've had to battle the media on top of everything else for being truthful about your story. And we're going to get to that later. But first, let's just talk about this roller coaster that you've been through. You had built a business. Then the pandemic hit, which affected everyone. And if that wasn't enough, the FBI shows up at your door, armed FBI. I mean, it doesn't even sound real.
It doesn't. If I hadn't lived it, I don't think I would believe any of it. But on April 2nd, 2020, so a couple of weeks into the pandemic, and we lived in Seattle where the shutdowns were full on, we got a knock at the door at around 6:45 a.m. And my immediate thought was like, is there a public health crisis happening like on the street? What's going on? Why are there people knocking on the door at 6:45 a.m.? And I went to the door with my 8-month-old baby on my hip, and to a man and a woman flashed their FBI badges. And I was like, what is happening? And I opened the door and they said they wanted to speak to my husband. And I called for my husband, and as a lawyer, and I would say this over and over again. I said to my husband in front of the FBI agents, and I didn't think my husband had done anything wrong. I said to my husband, you cannot talk to these agents without a lawyer. And so that began the saga. We learned that my husband was the target of a federal investigation. He was alleged to have committed a crime called private sector honest services fraud, which is depriving your employer in the private sector of your, quote, honest services. My husband's former employer was Amazon. And, it was a saga that it went from, when the FBI showed up at our door, it was very clear they believed he'd committed this crime of private sector honest services fraud. There was no discussion. There was no rationalizing with them. And from that point, it was just a blitzkrieg. I mean, the federal government raided our home on a second visit. They seized all of our bank accounts for 22 months. I did not know what civil forfeiture was before this happened to my family, but in America, the state, local, and federal governments can seize your bank accounts on the suspicion of a crime. They do not have to charge you with a crime, let alone prove one. And, Kristi, you were just talking about Trudeau and Canada and the truckers. And, civil forfeiture on any level is just a horrifying and abusive tool. And so that was, and you wake up one day, or for us, it happened in the middle of the day, and you have no money. And we had 4 little girls. And I remember my mother on the phone in Ohio saying, like, don't they care that you have kids to feed? And I said, no, the point is they want my husband to plead guilty to the allegations, and it's a pressure tool. And indeed, the federal prosecutors at the time told my husband's lawyers they would give my husband some money back if he saw fit to plead guilty to the allegations.
I
Um,
mean, and that's
also,
the thing. There's so many levels of entrapment. Again, going
yeah,
back to the validation of these agencies, there's entrapment at the level of just even coming and seizing your things and like looking for a crime instead of basically trying to look for a crime to validate the abuse of a person rather than how it's
yeah,
supposed to be done. And then the entrapment at the level of I don't know, we haven't talked about this, I don't know how you feel about January 6th, but in many cases this is what happened to them. Some of them that were peaceful and some of them weren't, but
yeah,
those that were peaceful were basically strong armed into pleading guilty because otherwise they were
yes,
going to face time behind bars. I mean, it's
yeah.
just
I think there's
so funny.
I mean, there's so many things here, and a couple of like levels to this. You mentioned Kristi, like the show American Nightmare or Take Care of Maya, and how it can impact people who might not believe that our law enforcement or federal agencies could be biased or acting improperly. It might help them. So I don't know if you know this about me, but I was a progressive for my entire life. I raised money for Barack Obama. I did get out the vote. I believed so much in all of it. And this experience rocked my world in so many ways. And I'm now in this, constant questioning of like, how does the left at this point still believe in these institutions, and why are they, when I was 21 years old and a Democrat, um, we would be so upset with the surveillance after 9/11 and everything that was happening in the FBI and Homeland Security. And now the left is embracing the FBI because they're going after people the left doesn't like. And it is such a dangerous thing, right? It is such a dangerous thing. And I think we shouldn't look at the abuse of power as a partisan issue. It's abuse of power, right? And,
Exactly.
and whoever's in charge
Exactly.
can use
And
it
and
as,
don't you feel like sometimes even this labeling is
yeah.
is a tool against us? Because just as you
Oh,
said, there was a time that the left was the ones that were for peace
yeah,
against war, and would be more for the people and against corporate
yeah,
greed, supposedly, blah blah blah. And then you've seen this major shift where it's like flipped, and so that's why I avoid uh,
yeah,
personally altogether, these labels, because it's just another manipulation tactic to divide us against each other when the real enemy is these government
mhm,
agencies, the government as a
yeah,
whole, these corporations. It should be us versus them, but instead they have us pitted against each other.
yeah,
What's crazy about this case, speaking of how they manipulate, what's shocking about your story is that in this case you have a big corporation, Amazon, that was essentially colluding and being able to backdoor call on the DOJ to help them persecute you. And as you alluded to before, they had a motivation for doing this. But was that shocking to you as well? That they basically, like, how fair is it that big corporates can call on the DOJ to essentially make a case for them?
it's not fair. It's absolutely unfair. And I think, Amazon, when they wanted to pursue criminal charges against my husband and a group of others, they hired a former federal prosecutor from the Eastern District of Virginia, which is one of the offices of the DOJ. And he went and he literally lobbied his former colleagues who he had worked with, who were still at the DOJ. And if you want to tell me that relationships don't matter, why did Amazon specifically hire a former prosecutor from that office to go do this? Right? And of course it does. Like, we would all be insane to say that relationships don't matter and relationships don't play a part in this. And the other thing is that, most federal prosecutors are going to leave office and go work in the private sector. And they are going to go work at law firms, and they need clients. And so, what better relationship to establish while you're still at the DOJ than one with Amazon, who has endless amounts of litigation and corporate work for you to do when you leave? So I think, there's so much to it. And Amazon has hired hundreds of former FBI agents, federal prosecutors, CIA agents. And that has been reported by Politico and a lot of news outlets. And I think it's just a real problem.
And to that end, there does need to be legislation or something in place, because we saw this happen with Twitter and Facebook. I
Yep.
mean, this is the public square of how we, the people, communicate with each other. And then you have government entities that are threatening our
Yeah.
freedoms, because they're allowed to be hired through
Yeah.
these basic forms of communication. It's crazy. And do you know if there's any plan or legislation to keep these conflicts of interests and motivations from happening again?
So far, there isn't. And it's so interesting that you bring up the Twitter example because I am so guilty. I got my news on Twitter and I had no idea that the FBI was essentially moderating content on Twitter. And when that stopped, my flow of information changed. My understanding of the world changed because it wasn't being moderated by someone who wanted me to hear X, Y, or Z. And I think that's so important for all of us to recognize and realize. And you asked about January 6th. It's like when January 1st, 6th first happened, of course, I was like, well, this is horrible, et cetera. But now that I know, why is the Department of Justice putting Americans in prison who didn't even go into the Capitol? Like, it's shocking. Like, why are we wasting resources on this? What is protest? Because I know that there were protests that damaged federal courthouses in the summer of 2020. No one went to prison for that. It's just this, but
And
you
we're
didn't see,
seeing
you
it
would,
continue. We've had the Middle East conflict, and we've had demonstrations and protests. There are demonstrations and protests in that case, even when they storm offices, or whatever inflammatory word you want to use. But
yeah,
it's an insurrection when people are concerned that their vote might not have counted. So I mean, it's
yeah.
happening to this day. This inequitable justice.
Yeah, and I think that it's for me, it was interesting. For me, the Hunter Biden laptop has been such an interesting thing. I will say, I don't think the DOJ should be prosecuting Trump, nor do I think they should be prosecuting Hunter Biden. And so, I think it's very political on both sides. I think it's all a shell game with not the interest of justice in mind, but different outcomes that people want. But you go back to the election in October of 2020, when how many former intelligence leads in America signed this letter that the laptop itself was a hoax? Like,
Mhm.
why are we not talking about that all day, every day? Like, that's insane that that happened. And it's a very dangerous thing. And it did interfere with the election, of course, right? The
I mean,
flow
it
of
happened on the
information.
debate stage. Biden himself
Yep.
was able to use that as a tool to be like, this is
Yep.
Russian disinformation. There's all these
Mhm.
intelligence officials that have signed a letter saying so. And that was allowed to be said. And now we know that they knew long before then that it was
Yeah.
accurate, and they had the documents, and they knew it was verifiable, and they pushed this lie and this propaganda. And this is not, it should not be allowed. But let's go back to the whole case of basically now in America, you're guilty before you're
Yes.
proven innocent. It's always that you are innocent until proven guilty, but we've more and more bled into this acceptance of we should assume guilt, and it's the
Yeah.
responsibility of you to prove your innocence. There was a case that I was just reading about safe deposit boxes that were seized, and fortunately, like after some time, it has been determined that that violated the U.S. Constitution. But this was after appeals and everything else. In
I know.
2021, agents raided a U.S. private vault, a business in Beverly Hills that allowed people to rent safe deposit boxes anonymously. So obviously, privacy was at play here. But they did this based on the belief that criminals were using the service. And when people who rented the boxes asked the FBI for their belongings back, the Bureau refused, saying it was going to file for forfeiture or transfer ownership to the government. So even if there was innocent people wrapped into criminal behavior, they still weren't getting their stuff back, their money back. And I mean, thankfully, justice was done. But the period of time in between where people didn't have access to maybe something they needed or wanted is insane to me. And this is what happened to you, is that, your husband was presumed guilty until proven innocent. And
Mhm.
as a result, that you didn't have access to your money, right?
Correct. And I think, in the private vault case, some Americans were storing their life savings in cash in those security boxes because they didn't trust the banks, which you're allowed to do, that is legal. And the government held their life savings for years. And they had to hire lawyers to fight to get their goods back. And that is what happened in our case. But I think two things to this. We didn't have a forum to even fight for 22 months. They took the bank accounts, and then we had no way to say, can we even prove my husband's innocent? We couldn't do a single thing. And so it was like, best of luck. I hope you can feed your children. And so we had to sell our home, liquidate retirement, sell our car, raise money, borrow money, move in with family, 6 kids. I had to leave my startup and get a different job to pay lawyers. I had to move to a different state from my daughters to get the highest paying job I could to pay lawyers, and partly to pay lawyers to fight to get our money back. And when the government had to make a decision, a judge finally said, government, you need to actually prove this case. The government said, just kidding, here's your money back. Yeah, I'm not, like, they just gave us our money back. And this wasn't just us. They seized our life savings and the money from my husband's business, but they seized over $7 million from businesses, families, investors, and they held it for 22 months. And yes, they gave it back. But in the interim, people lost their homes, people lost their businesses. There was a company called North Star that was part of this, a 20-year-old commercial real estate company. It was destroyed and 60 jobs were lost in a pandemic. And like, who answers for that? Who do you call to get that back? You can't. It's gone forever. And that's at Amazon's feet.
Yeah. Now, in the case of the safe deposit boxes, they were able to sue. Was there any ability to sue them for all of the legal costs and everything, and for keeping your money that could have been earning interest or whatever? Is there any way to hold them accountable for that?
So when we got the money back, we were very desperate for money because we were paying lawyers to continue to fight the DOJ's investigation that Amazon had started, and also Amazon's civil lawsuit. And so we made concessions to get our money back, including promising not to sue the government. But I will say, in March, at about a month and a half, the affidavits that were used to seize the money, because they had to have like a probable cause affidavit like you do with a search warrant, those affidavits will be unsealed. And I believe that Amazon gave the Department of Justice false statements about its employment duties, and it alleged my husband violated those duties in a criminal manner. And should my suspicions be confirmed, then I believe we have a very strong case against Amazon for malicious prosecution, abusive process. It's also a federal crime to lie to the Department of Justice. And once I see those affidavits, I very much look forward to asking the Department of Justice, who at Amazon will you put in prison for this? Right? Like, who will you charge with the crime? Or do they play by a different set of rules?
In these cases, somebody needs to be held accountable, or we're just going to continue to see abuse of power, and nothing's going to change. I want to talk about next steps moving forward as far as, this problem that we have. And if you're fired up about making sure it doesn't happen to other people, I want to talk about what the role the media played in this as you were going through this tragedy. Obviously, that's something I'm passionate about, being a former propaganda puppet in the mainstream news, but escaped. But I do have to hit a break. So we're going to talk more with Amy about these issues and this wild story. But first, I just want to take this moment and serve it as a reminder to do whatever you can to protect your assets. The old age, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't have it all in cash. Don't have it all in the market. Do everything you can to spread your assets around. It's not just diversification. It's not diversification, period, if you're diversifying your stock positions or your mutual funds, because it's still all in one place. You need asset class diversification. One of the ways that you can do that and diversify is a fixed index annuity. Dan Rosenberg is a wealth management professional, almost 40 years experience working with affluent families, as well as building products for money managers, large investment firms. As an industry insider, he has worked with and consulted thousands of other financial advisors, creating distribution for products. So if you want Danny's free report and to see if you qualify for a free consultation, you can go to Kristi.getanannuity.com, Kristi.getanannuity.com. I'll have the link in the description below to check it out. Time to start spreading things around. Maybe it'll be harder for the government to seize your assets if you have it in multiple places. All right, we're going to hit this break. And when we return, I'm going to continue hearing this wild story from Amy, who really serves as an inspiration. She made it out on the other side of this, which is what we need to hear. We need to hear positive redemption stories. So we'll have that with Amy after this.
Now I'm on the right side.
All right, welcome back. We are hearing a wild and crazy story from Amy Nelson, and it's far too familiar with other stories that we've been hearing. You know, basically, it was you against one of the largest corporations that there is, against one of the richest men in America, against the Department of Justice, as a mom of four, just trying to live the American dream, and your American dream turned into an American nightmare, right?
It did, and I think, I will say, Kristi, just yes, I am a mom of 4, and my husband did have 2 great lawyers up against Amazon's, 50, but also I am a litigator. I practiced for a decade, and I'm really lucky for that. I mean, what would we have done? Like, I had a certain set of skills, as they said, Liam Neeson said in Taken, but I had a certain set of skills
I love
that
that.
were really helpful here. And, and also the legal world, if you don't know it, it's like a foreign language. And so if you're a defendant, a target, and you don't have anybody to sit with you and explain with you what these strange terms mean or these strange processes, you're going to have to pay someone a lot of money to explain that stuff. And it's daunting and it's terrifying. And I think that prosecutors and other lawyers often take advantage of that.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that is just wild to process about this is that when they do these things, there is no human element of it. I mean, there is no human element when you're thinking about raiding a family home, with children, and what trauma that you're going to cause them when there's different things. Like, couldn't they have come to your husband and asked him questions without basically showing up armed? I mean, it's
Yeah.
unbelievable that this is what it's turned into. There's been a lot of talk about, is America becoming a police state? What do you think?
I think it is. I mean, I think that prosecutors have almost unlimited power. There is an amazing thought leader. His name is Clark Neely. He works for the Cato Institute, and he speaks a lot about the fact that American prosecutors have a, an unlimited power that almost no one in America has, and they really can't be held accountable. And when they have that power, you just use it and you become used to it. And so, like in the example of my husband told prosecutors from day one, like, I will talk to you. I have nothing to hide. They're like, great, come cooperate, meaning tell the story we want you to tell. And my husband's like, well, I can't lie. He refused to lie. And he said, I don't think I even violated my employment contract. We now know the prosecutors at that time did not have Amazon's employment contract. They did not ask Amazon, what are the terms of this man's employment? They didn't say, can we see the contract? So somehow they got probable cause to raid our home with weapons and to seize our bank accounts, alleging my husband violated his employment terms without knowing what they were. And that will always bother me. But I think it goes to prove, I think we do live in a police state where police or law enforcement prosecutors are willing to act on behalf of the word of someone they trust or someone they know, and certainly a former federal prosecutor going into his former colleagues and saying X, Y, or Z, they're going to believe him. And I think that's incredibly dangerous. It's very terrifying, particularly when you have companies like Amazon hiring former federal prosecutors. And, Amazon, a lot of people don't know this, but Amazon Web Services, which is where the internet lives in data centers, Amazon Web Services sells data center space. And Amazon Web Services earns tens of billions of dollars in government contracts with the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, the Department of Defense. Like, they hold our nation's secrets. And so, that's a very close relationship with a lot of police and law enforcement, and it's pretty terrifying. But I think it's so dangerous. And to your point you were talking about earlier, like, this should not be partisan. Everyone should be afraid of this.
Absolutely, because I mean, we have a Democrat president in power right now, and but there could be a Republican president in power in the
Mhm.
future. If you don't want it happening under this administration, then you shouldn't, be okay with it happening and again under another administration. I mean, there just
Yeah.
should be, again, it should just be we the people against the
Yeah.
government. I mean, that's what our country was founded on. We were trying to get away
Yes.
from a monarchy, and now we're becoming a monarchy again, basically.
I mean,
One thing that you talked about, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you're talking about the innocent until guilty until proven innocent, and speaking about like a police state and acting very undemocratic. When the Department of Justice charges someone with a crime, they literally hold a press conference. Like, you're holding a press conference to repeat your unproven allegations. But if the defendant speaks out, that can be used against them. Yeah, and it's very scary. It's used like a tool, right? It's used like a hammer, and it sounds like something that would happen in Russia or China, but it happens here.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're getting closer and closer to that all the time, and this should concern absolutely everyone. Because I mean, if you were the one that this is happening to, then you might change your mind about what's going down. Even if you hate Orange Man, bad Trump, whatever. If this was you that they were coming
Yeah.
after, saying like, "I think
Oh,
you overvalued properties." Wait, but no, but the banks say that there was no
yeah.
criminality, like that they're fine, that they love doing business with me. Nope, we think we have overvalued your properties. If that happens to you, you're going to have a very different opinion than just
Yeah.
because it's happening to Trump and you happen to hate him, right? I mean,
I mean, completely. Well, and it's to hear the department with Trump, to hear the Department of Justice say, "Oh, we have a right to a speedy trial." The right to a speedy trial is for the defendant, for the American.
yeah,
Like the government can't use that like a tool, and trust me, they never do. Like this is the only time they're ever doing it because there's clearly a political agenda behind it, and I think that
yeah,
most Americans, even people that don't particularly like Donald Trump can see it, and so it's
yeah.
it's a very dangerous thing.
Now, when you were talking about the mixture of Amazon and their ability to have surveillance and data processing that the government has access to, it reminded me of something that I read in one of the articles about a situation where you kind of had that realization, like, oh, we have, I think what's the thing called, an Amazon. Uh, Alexa or something, and
Oh,
you had
yes, we had an Alexa in our house.
yeah,
Yep.
thought about that, and you're like, "Oh, wait, they could be listening to us talking about what's happening to us and try and use that against us." And so you went and listened, and what you found was heartbreaking. Maybe tell me about that, like what you heard your daughter ask it a question, right?
Yeah, so I'll cry talking about this because it's just sad. My girls were really little when this started. They were 5, 3, 2, and 8 months. And I was reading this article from The Intercept or something about Amazon Alexa and how the Alexa was recording far more than your question. It would record for like a minute or two after you asked it a question. And so I immediately went onto my Amazon account and requested the download of my Alexa file, which anybody can do. And you should all do that if you have an Alexa in your home. Also, you should just not have an Alexa in your home and not a Ring doorbell either, because Amazon gives Ring footage to law enforcement. Anyway, I digress. But I ordered my Alexa history, and I was listening to the period of time since the FBI had come to our house because I was very nervous what I'd said around it. And I hear my little girl's voice say, "Alexa, why is mommy crying?" Just like broke my heart because it immediately changed our family. I went from being in a completely engaged, involved mom to just I was destroyed at first because I was so afraid. Like when that kind of power comes for you, people always say, "Oh, the truth always wins." The truth does not always win. That's the hard reality. And but I will say, like at that moment when I heard my daughter saying that, it was at that moment where I said, I have to do every single thing so that no matter how this turns out, she knows we tried. And that was, my
Yes.
inspiration for standing up.
And I mean, I think there's just so many moms that can relate to that. And I mean, when I was reading this, it's just like, I mean, I've definitely had struggles. I mean, now I'm years later having an infant. I'm trying to make independent news work after a successful
Yeah.
career in traditional news that had benefits, that had, all these things. And now I'm just trying to make it. And so I've had those moments of certainly nothing at your level even close, which kind of gave me a gut check, like, wait a minute, like I feel sorry for myself sometimes, but it's not to this level. But yeah, it's just so relatable because it's just we as moms are just expected always to be the superhero. We can't fall on the floor, and
Yeah.
cry and not get up, even though there are days that we want to just do that. We just want to be like, you know what, today I want to just lay on the floor and cry and be in the dust, but we
Yeah.
can't because there's too many people relying on us. So your story, I know we're always expected to be Wonder Woman, but yeah, there's so many people that can relate to that and get inspiration from your story. And so this is one story, finally, that has a happy ending so far. I always have to add that caveat so far, in that the DOJ actually did dismiss this, essentially, is what I understand of it, if you want to explain that in a
Yeah.
better way. And you were able to move on from this, right?
Well, yeah, so I think like at the, the top level, the Department of Justice returned the money it seized, which is almost unheard of. In this Amazon civil lawsuit that they filed against my husband, a federal judge ultimately ruled that my husband had not breached his employment contract, let alone committed a crime, and had acted in accordance with the explicit terms of his contract. And then on the Department of Justice side, two men had pled guilty to criminally assisting my husband in violating his employment terms. They didn't know what his employment terms were, so they were told that fact, which was false. But ultimately, in a move that former federal prosecutors have told the New York Times they only have one other example of, and that was with General Michael Flynn, the Department of Justice moved to vacate the guilty pleas it had obtained. The DOJ is not in the business of tossing out guilty pleas that it worked hard to get. And it did that in this instance, saying they were not in the interest of justice. And that was an astounding outcome. I mean, I was just floored. It was right. It was right. It was correct. But I did not expect that to happen. And it happened when it did. Because, sometimes Department of Justice can kind of just let things fade into the good night and, as the years go by. But they said they weren't prosecuting anyone related to Amazon's allegations. And it took 4 years of fighting to prove that Amazon was lying and wrong, but we did it. And I do applaud the Department of Justice for taking that step, because it had to be a little bit hard, right, to go up against Amazon and Jeff Bezos. And Amazon is throwing a tantrum like a toddler, essentially, about this. I mean, they're filing motions in court like the DOJ is wrong. They shouldn't decline to prosecute. And it's like, you can't tell the DOJ what to do. But I don't know, Jeff Bezos lawyers think they can. But it is a happy ending for us. But it isn't justice, right? Because justice is it never should have happened. And how do we get back to where we were? So another family lives in our house in Seattle. Our reputations will forever be, tainted by this. And it's part of why I want to speak out. I don't want Amazon to do this to another family. I don't want any company to do this to another family. And I want the world to know that, my husband didn't do anything wrong. And just because someone said you did doesn't mean you did. Right. And
Mhm.
it's not right.
Well, I mean, there's the other enemy in this, which is the complicity of the media. The media
Yep.
being so willing to be the PR machine of law enforcement and the government all of a sudden, when journalism was supposed to be an advocate for the people. It was supposed to be a check and balance for those people in power. And you, like in that American Nightmare, popular documentary on Netflix, were a victim of the media being able to pile on and essentially repeat defamatory statements. And you didn't feel like they were in your corner, right?
No, I didn't at all. I mean, first, a lot of journalists wouldn't talk to me. A lot like I think the phrase you would hear over and over again is, it just sounds so bad. Something bad must have happened. And at a certain point, I just said, you know what? I'm going to tell the story myself, because no one will listen to me. And so if no one will give you the microphone, just like take it in your own hands, like you did. And you gave up so much to do independent journalism. And I decided to use my platform and my ability to grow platforms to tell my husband's story. And I hadn't been on TikTok. I'm 43. I thought it was like a dancing app, but I knew it was a story that was easier told by talking. And so I just started a TikTok, and 1 year later, I have 185,000 people who tune in every day. And it's like 95% incredibly supportive, because people understand. And I love that. And it's people from all sides of the political aisle, right? They understand that this isn't, certainly my politics have changed deeply because of this experience. But I think that people understand this is just about power. And I think that's really important. And even to the point, Kristi, that at one point last year, Amazon's lawyers sent me a letter telling me that if I did not shut down my TikTok, they were going to accuse me of a federal crime of witness tampering. And I think it's so ridiculous in so many levels. I didn't do it. I kept talking. But the other thing is, Amazon's founder, Jeff Bezos, owns the Washington Post. So a newspaper owner, one of democracy dies in the darkness unless you're talking about me, I guess, is Jeff Bezos' motto. But a newspaper owner's company told a mom in Ohio to shut down her TikTok, or else we'll try to put you in prison. I think that is just horrifying.
Yeah, that was one of the things that caught my eye in your Twitter page, is when you were talking about, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, and yet he is advocating for suppression of free speech. And I mean, that's what's been so disappointing as a veteran journalist, is how many of these supposed news organizations have advocated for suppression of free speech on the basis of
Mhm.
supposed mis and disinformation? We just saw with the Canadian
Yeah.
court holding Trudeau accountable for
Yeah.
using misinformation to validate his abuse
Yeah.
of power. And yet these are the
That's
same people that are talking about the danger of misinformation, and we should take people's First Amendment rights away because of the danger of speaking, yet, they can use it to their ends. I mean, it's maddening,
it's
right?
just it's maddening, and I mean, like, the media is owned by corporate interests at this point, and when you look at Amazon, I was thinking, like, no one's ever done, like, a deep investigative report of Jeff Bezos, because I think they're all terrified of him, because not only does, he own his own media outlets, but Amazon buys more ads in media than any other entity in the world, and so you don't want to make your benefactor mad, like, you need the ad dollars. And that's just, and so, I mean, it allows for just terrifying and really bad behavior because no one will hold them accountable. So, to me, eventually I was like, well, if I get so public, they can't physically harm me. So,
Yeah.
you
Do
just
you know if
like,
any media has tried to ask him this question about, your family's experience or anything? Do you know if he's ever been confronted personally about it?
I do know someone messaged me that they had tried to approach him at a restaurant in Seattle, and give him this article. You showed it here earlier, the entrepreneur article. Um, but I don't know that he ever read it. I'm not sure.
Wow. And so where are you at today? Because basically, you were excited, you were starting this startup company as an entrepreneur. COVID hit, then this upended your world. So you were brought to the brink of bankruptcy. And so how did you do it? How did you do this? And what are you doing now?
Well, I think, my husband, who, hasn't really talked to the media, but will someday when his litigation is over, he's worked really hard to work and get back on his feet and support our family. And he is so courageous. I mean, he's the one who had to deal with this threat of being put in prison, not me. And I've been working the whole time. We raised money via GoFundMe. We sold everything we owned. And it's still been incredibly hard to pay for lawyers, but we're both entrepreneurial and hardworking. And we're like, we're doing this, right? Like, we're not giving up. And so, I still have my startup, The Riveter. We had co-working spaces before the pandemic. We do not anymore, but we have a newsletter where we speak to working women about, building their businesses and their careers. And then I'm starting a new business with my daughters, called Cotton Candy and Dreams, where we're creating curated family experiences because we want families to be able to spend time together and do things and do cool things together. And so we're creating this new business. And then my husband's working, and we live in Ohio now by my family, which is a silver lining. We're by my parents and my sister, which is incredible. But we're building our lives, we're living our lives, which in some ways, the best revenge. Like, Amazon didn't. Not only did they not beat us in court, but they didn't beat us down. We live. Like, my kids get one childhood. I'm not missing it. And at the same time, we are exploring all of our options legally. I think there'll be more chapters to this story because I think there should be accountability.
Because there's so much to tackle here, do you are you hopeful that your story and others that are like it can lead to legislation to prevent some of these things from happening? I believe I read somewhere on your Twitter that there was someone that was working on this abuse of power of the government being able to seize assets
Yeah.
before there's even charges brought. Can
Yeah.
you tell me about
Yeah.
that?
Yes, there's a bipartisan bill, to end to change and reform civil forfeiture and the practice of it. And, I was asked to testify before Congress the year before last. And at the time, I didn't want to because everything was so, um, our money was still seized. I was very much afraid of retaliation from the Department of Justice. But I think that we will be before Congress again. We've met with many senators and congressmen and congresswomen, and so I think we'll be back in DC doing that. I think our story is an incredible example of how civil forfeiture can be abused, and so we will advocate a lot for reform. And this is one of those things too, where like this should be completely nonpartisan because civil forfeiture primarily impacts immigrants, folks of color, and it's a tool that a lot of law agencies are allowed to keep what they seize, so they're incentivized to do it, right? And like that has
Yeah.
to change. Like, you should have an incentive to take people's things. And so I'm really excited to continue to talk about civil forfeiture. And I also would like to advocate for some additional reforms. Like, I don't think if you worked as a federal prosecutor in a specific office of the DOJ, you should ever be able to go before that office on behalf of paying clients. It's wrong. Like, you don't lose your influence and bias in 12 months or 24 months, right? Like, you always have that. So there's millions of other people you can represent. You shouldn't be able to do that. And so I think there are some other reforms that we could try to push forward. And then finally, I just want Americans to understand that the criminal system, our founding fathers built the criminal system using the right to a jury trial as a foundational right. They understood the clear need for Americans in the country they were building to be able to defend themselves. But now we live in a system of plea bargaining by coercion, by pressure. You're talking about January 6th. My friend, Brandon Strzok, who's a good friend of mine, he was outside the Capitol, did not go inside, and he ended up pleading to a misdemeanor. And, I don't know the details but they had arrested him in his home, immediately charged him with a felony, so I don't think he did anything wrong. He didn't go inside the Capitol, and yet he had to do this. And there's so many Americans that plea because they can't afford to pay lawyers. They can't, there's too much fear. Like when they were trying to get my husband to plead guilty, they told him that at some point, someday, they were going to raid our home in the dark of dawn and arrest him in front of our daughters. And so what we did when they told us that is we started getting our girls up at 5 a.m. and taking them out of the home for 3 hours for 6 months, because we just didn't want them to see that. No one should have to live with that fear. That is coercive. It's ridiculous. My husband wasn't accused of a violent crime. Why do you have to bring in the military to, arrest him? And so I just want to really work in teaching Americans about coercive plea bargaining and trying to reform that practice as well. Because I think if prosecutors understood they actually had to prove the crimes instead of get plea bargains, we'd have a very different system.
Now that you've been at your very lowest and have such a wild story that we weren't even able to cover, obviously, all of the details and all of the craziness that is your story. And we were talking about before we came on air, seeing these other documentaries like American Nightmare that give you something to relate to. Do you have any hopes, or are you in talks of your story becoming a documentary or even a movie or something someday?
I think it's stay tuned on that one, I think is the answer. I think,
I kind of felt like I knew that was going to be the answer, oddly enough.
Yeah.
You have any thoughts on who you would want to play you in a movie?
I don't know. I just think that I'm a big Yellowstone fan, and I think my husband should be played by Rip on Yellowstone. That's my wish. So.
I'm behind that. That actor's choice. Amazing. Well, how can we support you? You are very inspiring. I saw that one of the things that you're willing to do is hop on a call with people and dream up a situation for them, because you've been through the mud of okay, I gotta be inventive and try something else, and so you offer that as a service. What are other ways that people can help support you?
I would love for you to follow me on Twitter and on TikTok at Amy_K_Nelson to stay up to date with our story. That's all for now, right? We'll just keep sharing our story, and I'm going to start using my platform to share other people's stories that I think are really important. And I'm looking forward to doing that, because I think a lot of people who don't have a voice and don't have an audience deserve one.
And since journalism, what it's evolved into, no longer cares about being a voice for the voiceless, which is one of the main tenets. They would rather just be the propaganda arm of the government. We need more people like you. So often I say in this side of things, and independent media, it's not competitive. We shouldn't ever feel competitive against each other, because we need more people willing to bring the truth and willing to elevate voices, because we're up against so much, to try and get the truth out there and try and get people's stories out there. Well, Amy, thank you for your bravery, your courage, and being an inspiration for so many other moms and so many other people that are under the attack right now. We need stories like this that show, and then there is another side. You can get over that hump and that low point. So thank you for sharing your story.
Well, thank you. And thank you for what you're doing. I mean, it was hard to take a stand and leave a job with benefits and all of those things, but what you're doing is incredibly important. So thank you for sharing our story.
Sometimes I do want to, again, thank you, Amy, but sometimes I do want to start writing a book and just call it something about like being in the middle, because it's like, I don't feel like I'm on the other side. I'm still in the thick of it. And I think a lot of you can relate to that as well, right? Is there ever going to be like a time where I feel like I'm on the other side? I'm not sure, but it's, maybe the middle is what's most important, how we get through each day and each moment, and, and inspire each other while we're in the thick of it, right?